Hey there guys, turns out I had a lot more to say than I anticipated, so for your convenience, here's a little table of contents to get you where you want to go. My introduction of the whole video starts here. I give a quick overview of Dark Souls as a series here. I discuss the themes of Dark Souls 1 here, the themes of Dark Souls 2 here, and finally the themes of Dark Souls 3 here. I give a more technically minded review of Dark Souls 3 here, discussing gameplay, stats, and things of that nature. And I finally finish up by talking about the ending of Dark Souls 3 as the conclusion to the entire Dark Souls series. This is where the biggest spoilers will be, obviously. Anyway, do you ever just sit down and ask yourself, what makes a game a game? I think about it. I think about it a lot. See, because a game has to be more than just thing that operates on a game system or thing that calls itself a game. Things like Mario we can feel pretty comfortable about calling a game, maybe because they did so much to pave the way to what we call games, but games have changed. See, with the exception of online multiplayer games, pretty much all games primarily tell stories now. From Uncharted to Battlefield to Assassin's Creed, games today are stories first and games second. That isn't necessarily inherently wrong, but personally I don't pop a disc into my console to enjoy a good story. I play games to play a game. I can assure you with 100% certainty that I've never played a single game because someone said that the story was good. If someone said to me, "Hey man, have you played Infinite Undiscovery? It has a really deep and complex story," I would just answer with, "Sure, whatever man, but have you read Citing? It's crazy long and super in-depth about this fictional sci-fi universe." See, because games are not made to tell stories, at least not in the foregrounds. Books, movies, and hell, even paintings are inherently better at telling stories than games are. And it's because the engagement comes from the story. Whereas with a game, your primary means of engagement comes from action. Even in something as simple as a visual novel, which is 90% story, the primary thing that keeps a player involved in the story is action. Don't believe me? Would you play a dating sim or a visual novel with no choices? I wouldn't. That's called reading a book. At the end of the day, I think the thing that separates a game from other mediums is that the story takes a backseat to the gameplay. Even in games that put giant emphasis on story, like Metal Gear Solid or Heavy Rain, they have takeoff points, where the gameplay is pushed into the forefront, and from that point on is where the player gets into playing the game. Really clever games, like the aforementioned Heavy Rain, can integrate the story into the gameplay to make really unique and memorable moments. The weakness therein is that you're going to have a ton of moments where you're doing really benign things like walking around your house or having normal-ass conversations with people. What then, though, is the best way to tell a story in a video game? Not telling a story. The best way to tell a story in a video game is to not tell a story. Oh, the story should be there, and really there should be a whole lot of it, but you really gotta withhold it from the player so that they go looking for it themselves. It's a really new kind of concept. Really, matter of fact, the only thing I can think of that's even similar are like alternate reality games. The idea is to tell a story without words, to hide details throughout the game that imply more than tell a story. It's proactive storytelling. It rewards the player for digging into a story, with more story, because that's the way it operates. Players never feel bogged down by the story. The weakness with this game type is really only in its difficulty. The game has to be meticulous and deeply focused to pull something like this off. But other than that, I can't really think of many problems with it. I suppose that players that like tons of dialogue might not like it. Most players, though, should love it. If you like story, there's a great one hidden underneath the covers there for you. If you don't like the story, who cares? Don't look for it. And if you like a little of both, like I think most gamers do, you can enjoy the game at your leisure, playing the game when you want, and diving into the story when you want to dive into it. There are woefully few of these games. Journey does it pretty well, finding a fine balance between letting the player go on their own journey and letting them find out what the journey is about. On the other hand, Flower is entirely too vague, The gameplay certainly takes the front line, but the story is so much in the background I don't even know what the game is supposed to be about. I mean, it's clearly trying to tell some kind of story, but it becomes frustrating when not enough of the story is revealed. There is a vital balance between vagueness and obscured storytelling that you have to walk. Of course, the best example of storytelling in video games I can think of, and probably the whole reason you clicked on this video, is the Dark Souls series, including Bloodborne, but not Demon Souls, but simply because I've never played it. The Dark Souls series is something really special in games. I mean, really think about it. They are games that cater to hardcore and RPG markets, and yet have seen a mainstream success. It's really interesting because Dark Souls doesn't give you anything but the faintest glimmer of story. It requires you to read item descriptions and read environmental clues to put the story together. And yet it's a blockbuster AAA game. I don't know if it says something about the current game market or just the quality of Dark Souls. Either way, Dark Souls recently saw its final installment. But as a big fan of the game, I gotta say I'm kind of glad to see it go. But I'll get into that in a little bit. Let me give a very quick rundown of what Dark Souls is, as I see it. If the Elder Scrolls and I Wanna Be the Guy had a baby while Wheel of Time author James Oliver Rigney Jr. coached them along, you'd end up with something similar to Dark Souls. Dark Souls is a third-person fantasy game with all the tropes, swords, spells, and even dragons. But it puts gameplay before the fantasy, and places its chips in difficult and deep combat where mistakes are very seriously punished. Don't misinterpret that though. Nothing about this combat is realistic or even all that visceral. The best way to describe it is strict. Despite what you may have heard, this game isn't really that hard per se. It's strict. It demands that you play by the rules and will accept nothing less. So much of the game itself is built into that idea also. The games are really not very long. I beat Dark Souls 3 in less than 3 hours on my last run, and I wasn't even speedrunning it. That said though, my first playthrough took me just shy of 30 hours to beat, and in the course of 100%ing the game, I've dumped about 150 hours into it. See, your first time through the game is going to be confusing, difficult, and perhaps even mildly depressing as well. But the game was built with this in mind. See, part of the game is learning how to play the game, understanding stats, learning which infusions work best for you, forging new paths to explore, learning the best way to deal with other human players. These things all take time, and the game is built to demand them of you. Neglecting just one will end in your death or your stubborn frustration. But see, here's where we get to the James Oliver Rigney Jr. stuff. Dark Souls doesn't simply hand-wave your death away. It's an established part of the lore that's actually hugely important to understanding the world. In Dark Souls, you take the role of the undead, a type of person who is cursed to never die and eventually lose their mind to an unending cycle of undeath. This is why your character keeps coming back. It's not simply a game mechanic, even though it is a game mechanic, or even an in-game superpower. At the end of the day, it is a curse, one which your character cannot overcome. While they might be doomed to eventually lose their minds, if an undead can remain focused and motivated, they can avoid becoming insane or what they call hollow. Alternately, Dark Souls 2 also tells us that they can avoid becoming hollow by forgetting who they are and what they ever wanted. Remaining motivated means facing a nigh insurmountable task, and forgetting means losing everything about yourself. Mildly spoilers ahead as I discuss the themes of the first two Dark Souls games. Click here to skip. The two things I mentioned earlier, remaining motivated while facing a nigh insurmountable task, and forgetting yourself and losing everything, those were actually the themes of the first two Dark Souls games. The first Dark Souls was all about characters attempting to overcome some insurmountable task and eventually becoming hollow and losing themselves. Take Sigmire, for instance. A man set out with the given intention of going on a grand adventure. He is a self-made and powerful man that aims to overcome his challenges alone as a point of pride. Every time we see him, he is meditating over how to overcome a given problem. And yet every time he is unable to do so by himself. He gets saved by the player, until he finally finds a strange and new location, a place linked with the origin of all creation, And yet he was unable to make it here alone. Probably at this exact wrong time, his daughter finds him and tells him that his wife is dead. And just like that, he snaps, becomes hollow, attacking his daughter in one final bout of insanity before she gives him his last death. This, to me, encapsulates the broader themes of the first game, and even the lore there within, which I wouldn't dare spoil. It starts with a character. They state their motivation, and then they lose their motivation for one reason or another, ultimately losing themselves. This even applies to the player. If they lose motivation and quit playing, they in essence went hollow. It's very clever. In a lot of good ways, it reminds me of Alan Moore's The Killing Joke. All it takes is one bad day for a person to lose themselves completely. Dark Souls 2 played with this theme in a different way. Where Dark Souls 1 was about the loss of motivation, the abandoning of intent, Dark Souls 2 is very much about the loss of motivation by a different means: to forget. Again, mild spoilers, click your screen here to skip them. Forgetting is the quickest way to describe the themes of Dark Souls 2. While you are again an undead, this time your curse is described as eventually forgetting everything that makes you yourself, even your name. Take for instance the story of Lucatiel of Mur, a character that is very obviously driven by something. From the way she talks to the amount of fighting she is willing to do, it is clear that she will stop at nothing to accomplish whatever it is that is driving her. But at the same time, she's terrified that she will lose herself to the curse. She wonders if anyone will remember her name when she's forgotten it. She eventually tells us that she came here looking for her brother, who was a superior swordsman in every way, and yet still lost himself to the curse. It is clear from the context and locations we speak to Lucatiel that she was trying to find her brother, possibly to best him before she lost herself, or perhaps to learn and try to avoid facing the same fate as him. But alas, when we meet her for the last time, she can barely remember us, and reintroduces herself again and again, begging and pleading with us to remember her name, as she's not sure how much longer she can remember it herself. To me, Sigmaier's story is sad in its own way. A great man losing the drive and lust for life he once had before dying a misguided death. But Lucatiel is completely tragic. To start with great aspirations only to forget them and wander lost and confused. Her final lines of dialogue get me every time. Okay, but now that I've blathered on about Dark Souls 1 and 2 long enough, let's talk about the themes of Dark Souls 3. Spoiler-free this time. The director of the game, Miyazaki-san, said before the game was released that this would be the last entry into the series, and the themes of the game make that abundantly clear. To touch on the lore of the Dark Souls series a bit without spoiling the lore, all the games deal with a single cycle of death and rebirth in a doomed world. Many brave souls have tried to end this cycle, but eventually other brave souls overcome them and start the cycle over again. Dark Souls 3 is about the potential of the final cycle. It's about the end to things that have gone on too long. This is clear not only in the NPC characters, but in the world itself, and the legacy left over from past games. To be clear, the people of this world are absolutely horrified to face the end, and have done horrifying things just in recent memory to prevent the end from coming. Killing innocents, feeding children to monsters, and even betraying and defiling holy, chosen individuals. The people of Dark Souls 3 are nothing if not motivated. But ultimately, they are peering over the edge into the abyss. Just considering the gameplay, though, this is both the most refined and most accessible of all the Dark Souls games. Where previous game required players to upgrade every piece of armor and instrument of magic in addition to their weapons to reach the highest level of play, Dark Souls 3 ditches that and introduces refinements that make the game more fair, such as invaders only being able to invade players with similarly powered weapons, and within a fairly narrow level gap. The bosses this time around seem mostly built towards solo play, with early bosses actually being a bit easier to fight alone, while endgame bosses are a joke if fought with allies. The curve they were trying to make is obvious. They wanted the early game to be about learning to dodge well and pick appropriate weapons, while endgame fights put those skills to the test. This isn't a bad thing by any means, and even allows a sort of easy mode, in that a player always has the option of summoning for help on a boss fight they struggle with. The game looks better than it ever has, with sometimes jaw-dropping views and particle effects creating grand atmosphere. That said, I did experience frame rate drop bad enough to affect gameplay, but only in one location, and only after a patch. So maybe they'll patch it and fix it. The story is not as deep as the first game, or as sad and hopeless as the second, but serves as an amazing bookend to the series overall, even diving into the lore behind a few things that have been neglected in the past, such as the Firekeepers. The NPCs are some of the best yet, with some feeling like family right from the start, and others endearing themselves quite quickly. PvP is, I think, the best and most fair it can possibly be in a Souls game. The matching system is fair and prompt. Invasions are fun to attempt and nerve-wracking to endure, but they are never wildly unfair as they had been in past games. There's also just not a great way to gank low-level players. They will always partially be on par with you. It's always going to be primarily a battle of skill, which is the highest possible praise I can give a game like this. There are, of course, ganking situations and fight clubs and things like that, but if you make it to that level of play, you will eventually learn to deal with unfair fights. Overall, I rate Dark Souls 3 as excellent. I place it just above 2, and just below 1 on the scale of total quality. But it's head and shoulders the best PvP experience. I do miss the lore and characters of Dark Souls 1, but 3 offered its own amazing experience in its endings, which I will now spoil the crap out of. So if you're still playing the game or intend to play it, please go finish the game first. It's well worth it. So Dark Souls 3 has 3 endings, 2 of which are obvious callbacks to past endings and clear indications that the first flame cycle of death and rebirth will continue. If you link the flame, or if you betray the flame and become the Lord of Hollows, you are continuing the grand cycle that the world is in: death, rebirth, betrayal, and realignment. Dark Souls 3, though, offered us an alternative to the continuation of the cycle. See, playing through the game so many times, I started to notice the black goo that comes out of hollows and bosses sometimes isn't just reserved to enemies. It makes up the foundation of buildings. It's behind bricks. It hides under the ground. It reveals itself in beings the inhabitants of the world called angels. If you ask me, I think it's the Abyss taking hold. With the world's one bastion against the Abyss, the Undead Legion, now acting as Lords of Cinder, the Abyss has slowly been reaching into the world, grabbing more and more of it. An agent of the Abyss even once being forced to rekindle the flame. There's no escape for the world at this point. The Abyss already holds too much of it. This is the last cycle, one way or another. The Abyss is seeing to that. But then there is the curious case of the Firekeeper's eyes. These things would allow a Firekeeper to peer beyond the flame, to extinguish the flame, to usher in not just a world of darkness, but something beyond the Abyss. And you ask the Firekeeper to do it. They know only striving to rekindle the flame. The Firekeepers, they dedicated their entire lives to tending the flames. And now, you ask not just to usher in an age of darkness. Ages of darkness, by the way, have always been eventually overcome. You ask to end the fire. You betray the flame in a way so profound, Age of Dark doesn't even apply to what you are asking. You are asking for darkness beyond any hex. a blackness deeper than the primeval serpents could fathom. You are asking for a darkness so encompassing, the abyss itself would be swallowed by it. It would be less of a darkness and more of a place forgotten by whatever beings created the world in the first place. A place never made, an unmade kingdom. And yet she is willing to take the plunge. For you, unkindled one. She dives head first at your behest into a blackness unknown to any living creature. And you know what? I think this is the good ending. I think this is the best possible ending. And the reason? Despite the darkness, despite the end of the cycle, despite the literal end of all things, after it all, you hear a voice calling out, a familiar one, a friendly, loving one, simply asking if you can still hear her. There is something there, after all. I mean, at least that's my take on it. Anyway, let me know what you guys think. Let me know what games you'd like me to play, or what you thought of my thoughts. But until next time, cheers.